Okay, so I want to make a comment on the scenarios people wrote. The scenarios are really amazing, and they really illustrate the complexity and the everydayness of these different oppressions that are floating around, and in some cases their subtleness, which makes them no less insidious, right, and damaging. So I wish we could read them all, but we can't. But I have a proposal that I will give them to the host, and they will type them up. So I did not see anything in any scenario that could serve to identify anyone in any way, or even the location. But what I would like to propose, if the group agrees, that anyone who doesn't want their scenario written up, come to me after, and we will remove it. And if you don't come to me and ask to remove it, we will assume that we have your permission to write them all up and distribute them to all of you. Is that okay with folks? Because I think it's called passive consent, right? They, like when they want your kid to take a survey in school, they say, your kids are going to take this survey, and if you don't want them to take it, you have to let us know. But I want to read some of them now, and I want to add one more piece, which is when an offensive remark is made, and just also remember that when we could talk about, like, you're in a situation where a sexual assault could happen and you need to intervene. That's a bystander intervention. But when we talk about these kind of remarks, we're talking about the culture that gives permission to the more extreme event to happen. And the culture gives permission to the person who thinks that it's okay to continue thinking that it's okay, to objectify women or to see person only according to their skin color or whatever. So, and in the research is very clear that sexual harassment is correlated very highly with sexual assault. That workplaces and environments in which more sexual harassment occurs have more sexual assaults. So I think to talk about intervening in these types of remarks is very relevant to also preventing sexual assault, and I don't want us to think of it as something separate. The other thing, as I mentioned yesterday, there's an area of the sexual assault work that's called risk reduction or rape avoidance, where we teach individuals who are in risk groups how to understand and avoid and handle risky situations. And there's a value in it, and the reason I'm mentioning it now is many of these scenarios that people wrote are where you were the recipient of the remark and there weren't other bystanders, or you were the recipient of the remark and there were other bystanders, but you also had to decide what you were going to say. So I want to make two comments. In the end, to really change the culture, it's the bystanders who are not of the identity that is being discriminated against to intervene. So it's all of our responsibility to intervene, even when we are not the target. And I remember Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's a famous American philosopher who was an anti-abolitionist. And he said, when you have a rope around someone else's neck, you don't realize that the other end is around your neck. Right? So it's a metaphor because on one end of the rope you could get choked, and on the other end of the rope you could just like thwart your humanity, but you're both still hurt. So all of us have a responsibility, but there's another dilemma, which is what do I do when it's directed at me? And I think the bystander intervention skills would also be effective in those situations. But what I'm promoting more rigorously is the responsibility of the bystanders to intervene, not the responsibility of the target to respond. And I'm also pointing out from the point of view of sexual assault prevention that women who go through risk reduction or rape avoidance workshops, which include a self-defense component, are less likely to be raped. And when they are raped, are less likely to blame themselves and more likely to blame the perpetrator and have a healthier recovery. So we might also have a responsibility to offer to individuals in our community who are in difficult situations tools to deal with those difficult situations, but that's not prevention. That's not preventing the problem because it's not changing the culture. But you know, I haven't looked in your view book, but you look in the view books of all these campuses, it's like all the students of color are so happy to be there and everyone's smiling and all the pictures have a disproportionate number of students of color, which isn't the reality on that campus. And it's like, give me a break. That's not what it's like to be here. But if you choose to put yourself in that situation where you're going to receive mistreatment, we might have responsibility to help you negotiate that without justifying the mistreatment or assuming that that's going to end the mistreatment. So I just want to point out there's these like two poles, and in the sexual assault field, one we call rape prevention, which is primarily the responsibility of men, because male-identified individuals who assault care about what other men think, and risk avoidance, risk reduction or rape avoidance, which is teaching individuals from vulnerable groups, which is women and sexual minorities primarily, as well as others, how to deal with risky situations. Does that make sense? Because we'll see in a lot of these scenarios, it's like, what should I do when this happens to me, versus I saw this happen. So I'm just going to read a few, and then we'll go on. In a group student presentation, 4 students presented a project to a jury of 4 male reviewers. The student group consisted of 1 male and 3 females. All the reviewers addressed their comments only to the male student, ignoring the 3 female students. As the reviewers were volunteers, I did not know how to respond as the course instructor. Interesting. It's like, we also really need to help our faculty because they're in these situations and they're seeing them and they don't know what to do. So this would be very common. So in this situation, you have the instructor who's uncomfortable. You have all the members in the class who are bystanders, but some of them who might not even realize what's going on. And then you have the panelists who are engaging in sexist behavior, right? Because they're only talking to the males. So this is an interesting one that could have a lot of angles. Because maybe even the professor could come in and talk to the whole class about this. But that could be problematic because then how would the reviewers feel? But maybe the professor needs to talk to the reviewers. There's like so many ways you could go with this. But you need to go do something. At the end of a seminar where the faculty were all male and grad students were all female, I saw a male faculty member touch a female grad student's hair and say, "You'll need to do something about this during your next interview." We don't know if this person was a person of color with a different kind of hair or not. This is very common. When I was here last time in the same hotel, I was in the elevator, and there was a man of color with dreads in the elevator, and he was talking to his friend on the phone, and he was talking about how someone didn't like his hair and all this, or maybe he couldn't apply for a job. I don't remember what it was, but I decided when I got out of the elevator I would say something to him, because he was talking in front of me. I said, "I think that's really sad, and I'm really sorry that you have to think about that, and I consider that racist." Like, that was how I decided to not be a bystander. And I actually know of a female student of color who decided that she was going to undo her braids when she went for an interview because she wanted to get the job. Now, is that racist? Yes. Is the world racist? Yes. Is the racism going to go away tomorrow? No. Does she want that job despite the fact that they're going to judge her by her hair? Yes. So that's a decision, but we obviously want to live in a world where that wouldn't make a difference. Or if I was on the interviewing committee, or I was the colleague of this, if I was at this social event and I heard the other colleague make it, I could also intervene. I just wanted to read some of these because they're so everyday, which shows how pernicious is what we're dealing with. At a discussion at a faculty senate meeting regarding a report on gender bias and pay equity, a comment was made by a man faculty member. We don't know if this comment was to everyone or like a side comment. "Well, women have children and just aren't as productive as men." So what would you say? I don't know what I would say. What would I say? I would say, I know some female faculty members who are more productive in their scholarship than any man on this faculty, and they happen to be productive in having children also. I don't know if I would say the second part, but the point is, you have to think about what you would say in all these situations. But I think, by the way, these are the kind of questions we want to ask on surveys, right? Because we want to really find out what's part of the everyday reality. Okay, well, this is more extreme offensive remark, more extreme in the sense of more blatant. At a work party, because remember, by the way, the person, the faculty member who makes the hair comment might be an example of what we call benign or paternalistic racism or sexism, which is they thought they were helping the person by letting them know, which in some way could be true, but the way it's done, it's the issue of, as a white male, do I say something, and what's my motivation? Am I trying to help or save people? At a work party, the spouse of a coworker said, "As far as I am concerned, there is no place for all these faggots at work. I just find them all so offensive." Am I right? The person was looking for affirmation. A member of the conversation was a gay coworker. So we could role play some of these later, but I just felt I didn't want to hold them. And all of these are like this. All these are great in the way that's really sad because they're real. But it just shows us what we're dealing with and why we're talking about culture and why we have sexual assault. Because if I'm a sexual assault perpetrator, this is all giving me encouragement. Okay. So thank you all. And if anyone doesn't want me to have their submission typed up, you will tell me and we will remove it. But I think it'd be great for you to all read these and think about how you would respond if you were the bystander. So we want to talk about the social norms piece, which is usually not discussed as part of the bystander piece, but which I feel is essential to discuss. And the recent research shows how important a part it is of this issue. And in my opinion, explains why we have the rebound, because we're not dealing with one of the underlying inhibitors of bystander intervention. So the norms refer to the acceptability of an action or belief. So if you go into an Orthodox church, you stand while you pray. If you go into a Catholic church, you sit while you pray. If you go into certain Jewish congregations, the men cover their head, and the women too, with different kinds of head coverings. In other words, you go to a mosque, and the men kneel and the women sit in the back. When my wife and I were in Turkey, we went to a lot of mosques, and I decided I'm not going in a mosque where we're not both equally able to appreciate the beauty of the mosque. Because all these situations are set up in a certain way according to certain assumptions. But in this case, I'm talking about norms about dress. Right? I could give other examples of uncomfortableness in other religious settings. But the point is, the environment shapes the behavior, and the behavior in the environment is considered a norm. And the norm is understood by everyone involved. There are unspoken rules, but in many cases where it's not public, like I don't know how much the people in the room drink, or I don't know if you're sexually active or not, or how much, or I don't know your attitudes about certain things. So all that information about you is hidden from me. So I have to guess. I'll give you another example, like I always dress up a little when I present. Like I don't normally wear this. I only wear this when I come here. I work at home, so sometimes I'm in my bathrobe until lunch. So it's not normal for me except when I'm presenting. But like if I go to South Dakota or Idaho or Wyoming, I could wear dungarees and it would be totally okay as a presenter, and cowboy boots because it's a different norm. But I usually forget and overdress for myself when I go there. Okay, so when you don't know what's going on for someone, you have to guess, and that's called a perception, and very often the perceptions are wrong. So most people think that other people drink more than they really do. Most people think that other people are more sexually active than they really are. Most people think that other people are less uncomfortable than themselves by an offensive remark. So when you have a norm that isn't perceived correctly, we call that a misperception. Whereas how you dress if you go to a place of worship is like a very public norm that people don't have confusion about. So they can be correct or misperceived, and we know this is like hundreds of studies I'm just synthesizing. Men and women overestimate others' negative behaviors and underestimate positive behaviors. What does that say to us about us as a human species, that we overestimate the negative about each other and we underestimate the positive about each other? Women and men underestimate others' willingness to intervene, discomfort with risky behavior, sympathy for victims, respect for someone who intervenes. If you want the research, it's on my website. Some of the people in the room and myself write really boring articles with like 5-page references. But I don't want to spend our time like going into individual studies. But these are all synthesis comments summarizing a lot of research. Now here's the interesting thing. The problem individual overestimates others' agreement. So college students in general think that other college students drink more than they really do. But heavy drinkers overestimate even more, including about the drinking in their own heavy drinking friendship group. So whenever you have someone who's engaging in, let's just say, risky or problematic behavior such as gambling, gamblers think that more people gamble. Like if I'm a gambler, let's say I lose a lot of money on internet gambling. And we took a survey now, and you all had to say, how much money did you lose gambling on the internet in the last month? And you had to guess how much on average other people in the room had lost. I would overestimate more than anyone else in the room. Now you see how that justifies, that's an unconscious mechanism for me to justify my own gambling behavior. Because it's like, hey, what's the big deal? Everyone does it. I'm not the only one. It's, quote, normal. So there's really amazing research now about sexual assault perpetrators overestimating the agreement and support for their beliefs extremely more than everyone else, and even of their best friends. So that when we talk about culture influencing behavior or peer pressure, we're not only talking about perceptions of what other people think and do as determining people's behavior. And it's not having accurate information. And in the case of a person who's problematic, the lack of accurate information encourages them to be more problematic. And in the case of the rest of us who want to do something, the lack of accurate information discourages us from doing what we want. And the leader's role is important because if I'm a resident advisor, actually, I like the example of tour guides. When my daughter was applying to college, I would go on the tours with her, and there'd be a bunch of seniors walking around, and finally one parent will say, well, what about like drinking at University of Minnesota? And their like son or daughter would go like, oh no, why did my mother or father ask that question? And the tour guide they would try and be cool. They would go, well, I'll be honest with you, we have a lot of drinking here, but if you don't want to drink, people respect your decision. Is like that your admission strategy? That if you don't drink, you don't fit in here, and you're like weird, but people tolerate you, but if you drink, you'll have a good time? And that's not true. So the truth is probably that most of our students drink, but a very substantial minority of 20 or 30% don't. And those who drink very infrequently and casually, but there's also a small group of students who drink in more extreme ways, and usually they don't do as well academically. That would probably be a true statement. Imagine the effect of that on an admissions tour. Because what are you saying about the institution? And then, of course, what percent of students from here are from Minnesota, from this campus? 60, okay. And maybe some of the smaller campuses have a greater percentage. So the point I want to make is when you're going to a state institution, everyone back home is also feeding the misperception. Oh, I had a great time when I went there. We had fantastic parties. So your barber and your coach and all these people, your hairdresser, are feeding the misperception. So we call those people carriers of the misperception. And even though they don't engage in the behavior, they're talking about the behavior in such a way that it fosters the misperception of the behavior, which in turn encourages the behavior. So a lot of this is also really training our leaders how to talk about the community in a way that's accurate. And the research shows that the leaders also carry the same misperceptions. And we know, as I've been saying, that bystander behavior is inhibited when you don't know that other people are also concerned. Which is why, it's a whole workshop tomorrow, because correcting norms is a prevention strategy that can be used in a media campaign or in a group or with an individual, but is also a critical component of bystander intervention. Yes, and to find that out, you should come tomorrow, but in case you can't come tomorrow, I'll tell you. So the question is, why does the misperception exist? It's a different way of framing your question. And the idea of salience, that certain behaviors are more visible. So maybe people talk about the party they went to in the weekend, but they don't say, oh, but I was in the library until 1 o'clock studying for my term paper. Like, people don't brag about that, which is, why not? Why people don't say that. So what is more visible gets more noticed, and what is more extreme gets talked about more, including in the newspapers, right, in the media. So the misperception is fed by all these things, and if we understand what feeds a misperception, that's a bystander scenario. Someone could say, wow, that was such a wild party last night. Did you see, like, Alan and Barry dancing on the table? And you say, well, actually, I saw 100 other people sitting around just talking quietly, and a lot of them weren't even drinking. So you correct the misperception that's being spread. Well, I'll let you make your own personal decision about that as a faculty member, and I will not comment on that. But it is true, just to take that another step. There are academic environments where people underestimate other students' academic motivation. So, like, people really want to succeed, they care about their academics, they prioritize it very high, but they think that nobody else cares, so they don't talk about the fact that they went to the library or that they got an A. And there are other environments which it's the reverse. It's like super hyper competitive, and no one would say that they went to the movie Saturday night and they didn't open a textbook. So it's part of everyday life, and we need to be aware of it. So when the majority thinks it's a minority, that's called pluralistic ignorance. So you're in a group, someone makes an offensive remark, it bothers you, but you don't think it bothers anyone else. But if it was a cartoon, you would see that it bothered everyone except maybe one or two of the other bystanders. So you're in the majority, but you think you're in the minority. You're ignorant of the plurality. Like, let's go back to that scenario of the faculty member making a remark at the faculty senate. Let's assume it was in public, that women can't be as productive in their scholarship because they have to take time off to have babies. What did the majority of faculty members think of that comment? Would it be nice to know? I mean, in that particular case, you can't. You can't send out a survey, say, what did you think of that comment Alan Berkowitz made at our last faculty meeting? But you can send out a survey that says, have you been uncomfortable at faculty meetings about gender remarks about women faculty, and see how often that happens, and then have a conversation about it. Yes. So that's an important question, which what if we find that there isn't a misperception and there is a problematic attitude? So we're talking about two things. We're talking about there are attitudes or beliefs that need to be changed, and then there are attitudes or beliefs that are misperceived or under or overestimated. And they both coexist. My experience is that when you find out there's not a misperception, if you change the question, you get a misperception. In other words, there's a clear position here and there's an ambiguity here. And in this case, what we want to do is surface the ambiguity, because even if, let me give you a different example, okay? Even people who hold prejudices against certain groups don't believe that it's acceptable to express those prejudices by expressing violence towards the members of those groups. But they might think that most other people who share their prejudices think it's okay to express violence. So if we wanted to end the violence, we could identify that most people in this community, whether or not they think, independently of whatever they think about X, believe that it's wrong to violence. But my opinion would be, over time, that would also serve to change the underlying attitude. So what you're asking is really a strategic question. Because the misperceptions almost always exist, but let's say at the end zone of the misperception, there might be an attitude or belief that we actually want to change that could be held by the majority. Does that make sense? But for instance, in the 60s, when the US government was desegregating the South, some social political scientists did a study, and the majority of white people in the South and in all regions of the country were in favor of desegregation. But the majority of white people thought that the majority of white people were in favor of segregation. And the white people who were in favor of segregation overestimated the most. And then what the researchers did was interesting. They called you up the next week in a seemingly unrelated event that wasn't tied to the study, and they asked you if you would donate to civil rights. And the white people who overestimated other white people's support for segregation were less likely to donate. It's like, why should that make a difference? If you believe in it, give your money for it. It doesn't matter what you think other people think, but it's like so powerful that the misperception really needs to be addressed, even though you're right. You know, my grandmothers couldn't vote, and actually my grandfather couldn't have gone to school here, right? So, I mean, these things are real, and we have times when a majority of people believe in things that are wrong. So this isn't the solution to everything. This is a strategic tool that you use in a strategic way to, let's say, to begin diluting the problem. But that's why we need laws. Sometimes we just say, this is wrong and you could get busted if you do this. It doesn't matter what you think.
You're going to find out.
Right, you see, this is a tool, right? Tomorrow is really the whole day for the social norms approach. But the social norms approach is a tool. And there's some people who think it's the answer to everything and you don't need to do anything else. And I don't agree with those people. It's a strategic tool and you use it in a strategic way for a strategic purpose. So in this case, if the institution wants to diversify the faculty and make offers to qualified females, to individuals who are very qualified who happen to be female and want them to come and they're in significant relationships with men or women, then that's a real issue. But there might be attitudes surrounding that are misperceived that prevent you from moving forward. So then you identify what those attitudes are, maybe in a focus group, and then you conduct a survey, and then you have a questionnaire that says, would you support the University of Minnesota helping the spouse of an applicant find a job on campus if that person was qualified and appropriate for that job? And most people would say yes, but they would say, but other people wouldn't. And now you announce your data, and now you have less people complaining. Because here's the other half of the coin that you need to consider. The person who's in the minority who thinks they're in the majority complains more. They're very vocal. Whereas the person who's in the majority that thinks they're in the minority is silent. So when you have public behavior, you have certain people being very outspoken and self-righteous, thinking that they're speaking for everyone, and other people are silent, and then they go ahead thinking that everyone's agreeing with them. So you have to look at both sides of the coin at the same time, and it's very pernicious because one feeds in the other. The more we're silent as bystanders, the more the other people keep thinking that it was an okay remark, and that other people thought the joke was funny. So, but once again, the normative feedback is a strategic tool that you use in a strategic way based on information about a norm that you believe is misperceived. And in this case, if you have something that the norm isn't misperceived, you don't use this approach for that. Which is the point. This table is giving two examples. And in some cases, you might just pass a law that says, we don't care what you think. You have to room with whoever we put you with. And if you don't like something about the roommate we put you with, then you decide if you want to come here. You know, so I'm not saying it's a solution to everything. I'm saying it's a big part of the solution to this. So I wanted to give you a few case studies to see how these two go together, and we'll still leave time for the role play. So this is a small group workshop that was done at University of Central Missouri for fraternities and sororities, where they collect data about what the members believe about each other, and they document the misperceptions, and then they give them back the misperceptions about themselves in the small group. So if this was a department or a workplace, we would give you a survey about how you feel about certain things and what you think other people in the room feel, and then I would come up here and show you the results and say, why is it that you all thought it would be okay to help the spouse find a job, but you said most of the other people in the room wouldn't agree? And then they do something really cool, which is they have a bystander video contest. So fraternities or sororities could make a video about bystander intervention and submit it and win a prize. And I really like that, because then it's like we have to figure out what's the scenario, how are we going to intervene, what should you say, what should you say? So while we're making the video, we're training ourselves. And one of the points about this is, which they also have a media campaign, so it's what I keep arguing, that you need multiple synergistic, mutually reinforcing interventions and not just one thing. So maybe if the bystander programs also had social norms media campaigns, the effects would last more than a year because they're giving it a booster. So they ask about your drinking, when you would like someone to intervene on your behalf. I think that is one of the most brilliant questions I've ever heard. I want you to step in if I'm going to drink while driving. Now you already know you have permission. When you would intervene, how much you're bothered. And remember, for each of these things, they ask about yourself and your group. So we have what we call the individual norm and the group norm, and we compute them. We see if there's a gap, and that's where the norm is misperceived. And the point of my doing this now is because this is a way to get people to intervene more. Tomorrow we'll spend the whole morning on it. So they have a workshop and they do role plays. So here's an example. This is one fraternity. How much does it bother you when you notice an intoxicated chapter member harassing or bothering someone? You see 73% say they are bothered very much. But 50% think that it bothers most of my fraternity members only somewhat. And only 11% correctly perceive that it bothers most of my fraternity brothers very much. So you see the gap? You see the misperception? The reality is more healthy than the perception. In this one sorority, 100% said they wanted someone, to do all these things when they were in a certain situation. And then they had a media campaign, right, to reinforce the message that was so. Just if I was making general recommendations, we want to document and reinforce the positive. Like, you know, when somebody intervenes and it blows up, it gets in the newspapers. Like in Portland last year, 2 men were killed on the subway, right, who tried to intervene. But maybe on the Portland subway, there were 90,000 positive interventions in the last year that we don't know about it. And maybe those 2 men tried to intervene in a confrontational, belligerent way that provoked violence. So we need to start talking about all the positives that are happening all the time. Like I said, like you asked the question, did someone intervene in a situation on your behalf? Did a white person, how often would people of color say that a white person intervened against racism that they experienced or homophobia? In other words, it's not that we don't have a problem, it's we don't know all the good things that are happening to address the problem, and that's also important to know. We need to define the event because, as we said, the way these things show up in different places are different. We need to hold bystanders accountable but not punish them. We need to have synergistic interventions, and we need to combine social norms, and we need to encourage leaders to foster positive norms. So a leader might say, without mentioning names, I'm really proud to know that last weekend somebody in this group did this and this and this. Okay, so let's talk about the intervention options. And we talked about these. So you can talk to the person or you can talk to the other bystanders. So if Barry decided that he didn't want to say something at that moment when the skin color reference was made, you could later talk to the other bystanders and ask how they felt about the remark. And maybe you would decide that I'm friends with the person who made the remark, so I'm a better person to ask them about it than you because he doesn't like you or something. So you talk to the person or the other bystanders, you do something now or later. If there's an emergency, you do something right away, but even in an emergency, you might have 5 minutes to talk to other bystanders. You could confront the person, which we talked about. You can shift the focus, which is indirect intervention, and you could talk to the person about what happened. Like going back to the example where the employee makes an offensive remark to the employer in the supervision meeting, maybe you decide, I'm not going to talk about this now. But later on you come up to me and say, Alan, there's something else I wanted to talk to you about that I felt wasn't appropriate to talk about in our meeting. Could we just have a minute together? And you could say, I really felt it was important to talk about your performance reviews because you're doing a great job and you're really an asset to this department. But I also was curious what you meant when you said X. So there's a context. Now, remember when I walked across the parking lot because the teenagers were throwing garbage, I created a context. We didn't know each other. But sometimes you can create a context. There's this great video in my website about how the flight attendant made an offensive remark and I didn't know what to do, so I pretended I needed to go to the bathroom. So I went to the front of the plane, and as I was going in the bathroom, I had a conversation with the flight attendant, and then when it was finished, I pretended to go to the bathroom. But I want to, when he brought me water, he said to me, is everything okay? Because he could see I was like in the middle of something, but it was a very sexist remark that he made. So I just felt I needed to create a context that would allow me to have a conversation. So either you have it or you create it. You see something that feels needs to be addressed, you're involved in the situation, and you're willing to bring about change. And as we said, the situation shapes the intervention, and it's very situation specific, which we saw from all of our examples. Okay, so now we're going to skip this part, and we're going to come back to it. Because this is where we would do the, well, I'm not actually, I misspoke. Think of your example that you wrote so that we can see how these different responses could apply to your situation. So one is you make it clear that something isn't okay. And usually that's, if you have authority, that's part of your job. And as we said, when it's public, you have responsibility to respond publicly. I'll tell you one of my great annoyances in life, which fortunately does not apply to your president and why I'm here, which is I go to a campus and I walk through the residence halls and there was like a racist incident on campus or something, and there's all these letters from the president all over that we will not tolerate this and we will not tolerate this. Like, that isn't enough. because it's so removed. If you're my friend and we care about each other and I tell you it upsets me, it has a different effect on you. But just putting a letter on the bulletin board is like a very weak intervention that doesn't produce outcomes. But doing it in interpersonal, now, if you don't, if I don't really care about what you think at all, telling me you're upset isn't going to be effective. On the other hand, telling me that you're upset might make you feel better, so then it'd be a good reason to do it, because you don't have to stuff it. You know, you could just say what you feel, and it feels so good to say what you feel, but then you're doing it for yourself. It's not a bystander intervention in the sense that it's going to change me. But let's say it's a mental health choice. And by the way, when you do these role plays, one really good technique is, so let's say we're doing this role play about the hair. No, let's pretend we're at a, let me change this a little bit. We're at a social event, and someone says, well, women have children and just aren't as productive as men, that's why they can't publish as much research. And that remark really pisses me off. So I'll pretend I'm the one who wrote it. So you're going to do a role play with me. One way to do the role play is say, okay, Alan, first, you're just going to say everything you wish you could have said, nothing censored, expletives, anything you want, just say whatever you want. They say, you asshole, how could you believe that? And I really let it rip. And you just like take it all in. Now that I've done that, I could do a really great role play because I'm not like stuffing my emotions. This is from National Coalition Building Institute. They have a really good module on this. So sometimes it's really good first to just let your feelings out about it. And also, as I said, it's very educational for other people to see how these things, how these things affect other people that we don't realize. Like my friend on the subway who I didn't even notice was being completely dissed. And then after you, let's say, get it off your chest, then you go back and do the role play. And sometimes you might do that, like someone makes a remark that really outrages you, and you grab a colleague and you say, can I go talk to you in your office? And you let out all your upsetness, and then you say, okay, now what am I going to do about this? So dealing with the emotional piece is very important, and it's also not usually part of most bystander trainings, which is maybe also why there's a rebound, is people aren't doing the healing piece. So let's say that first I just let myself get really upset and say why that pisses me off. And then we role play and we use these different techniques. And maybe I would say to that person, you know, I'm really offended by that remark, and I would appreciate if you don't say it around me again. That would be a confrontation. And it may or may not work depending on what the person thinks of me, but if it makes me feel good, that would be a justification. And as I said, if you're an employer or an authority, you have responsibility to address it in such a way that other people who also witnessed the remark know that you addressed it. So I was conflating these two. One is you, as an authority, you say something. Another one is you state your feelings. The indirect remark, right, we say is more subtle, is you don't participate. You say, oh, excuse me, I have to go, and you leave. And then all of a sudden, all the other bystanders leave, and the person who made the remark is alone. You change the subject. So in the movie example, you just start talking about another movie. You don't give any energy to the remark about the skin color. You shift the focus, which is you replace the negative with the comment. So you say, there's some women in my department who have more children than my wife and I do, and they have twice as much publications as me. Because there's an assumption underlying the remark that's wrong. So rather than confronting the assumption, you state an example of the assumption being untrue. Does that make sense? So these are what I call indirect interventions. The shifting attitudes, which is from NCBI, is non-confrontational, and it reduces defensiveness, and it addresses the ouch. The ouch means that there's something underneath that is upsetting the person. So even if they're misdirecting it, you listen to their upsetness, and then you give them an alternative way of thinking about it, such as the man who wasn't promoted by a female supervisor and has like negativity towards female authorities. You can say, I really feel bad for you, and that was really unfair, and I'm sorry that happened. But there's still really great female supervisors in the world, and I have 3 of them, in my life. That's where you have to be willing to have a conversation with the person and listen to them. So maybe going back to the skin color thing, you could go back and say, I've been thinking about what you said, and I'm curious, is there anything else you think they have in common? The actor in the movie. And then you talk and you say, actually, I have more in common with him than him. And, whatever. You see what I'm saying? But you have a conversation. It helps the person understand why the behavior is problematic. Let me give you one good example. I was doing this training on a campus, and I came back to the same campus the next year. And a white woman raised her hand, and she wanted to tell a story. She said, whenever she would go home, her father would use the N-word, and they would get into a fight. And you can understand her father's point of view. If he thinks he has a right to use that word, he doesn't like his daughter coming home and telling him what he could say in his own house. And you could understand her point of view, that she doesn't want to go home and hear her father talking that way. So after she went to the workshop, she went home the next time when her father used the N-word. She said, Dad, I never asked you before, I'm sorry, but can you tell me, why do you use that word? Why is that a word in your vocabulary and not in mine? And he gave her a whole story about when he was young and everyone used that word and it wasn't any big deal. And, he told his story. And she said after that he stopped using the word. But it's like she never took the time to listen to him about why he used the word. And when he felt listened to, he was willing to not use the word because they care about each other. Otherwise, why should go home on the holidays? So it isn't always that good, right? It isn't always that nice. But the point is, it's an example of how it could work. It corrects the underlying assumption. And it's not good with someone who's toxic, who just wants to complain, who's usually is correlated with being a sexual assault perpetrator, right? Okay. So how do we put this all together? Are we going to intervene or not? Are we going to intervene now or later? Now or later could be within a 5-minute time frame or a many-day time frame, right? It depends. When it's a verbal remark, it could be appropriate to intervene later, and when it's a dangerous situation, you might just have time to figure out what to do. Are you going to talk to the offender or the other bystanders? If you talk to the offender, if you talk to the other bystanders, you're going to find out, how did you feel about that remark that Alan Berkowitz made? Do you think we should do something about it? What should we do? Well, Sarah invited him. She's going to have to be the one to talk to him. So we're going to go talk to her and tell her that Alan made this offensive remark and that we think someone should talk to him. We think that you're the right person. And then she might say, I don't really think I'm the right person. He doesn't seem to respect me or think I'm important, which isn't true, by the way, because we wouldn't be here without her great organizational skills. But pretend she feels that I won't take her seriously. So we decide who I would take seriously. Maybe I would take the dean of the graduate school seriously. Well, maybe that's because I'm sexist, right? But still, in that situation, let him use his white male dean privilege to intervene with me, as long as we're being strategic and we know what we're doing. And maybe actually Sarah would intervene better, but in this case it wouldn't be as effective. So that's where you just talk about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And then you decide on the next step. And sometimes, another way the bystanders can intervene, if someone is the target of an offensive remark, then you go up to the target and you say, this is really offensive. I don't really think this is fair. I was really proud of my daughter. This is on one of my video clips. When she went to graduate school, the first event for her graduate orientation was a social event with food. It was like food, food, food. And it was Ramadan. And she was aware enough to realize that Muslims don't eat on Ramadan until it gets dark. And she saw there were some Muslim women in her program. So she went up to them and she said, I feel really bad. I think this is really wrong. She's an optometrist now, that our optometry college is not aware that you can eat, and they're welcoming us here by giving us all this food. So that was a really powerful bystander intervention. And she may or may not feel that maybe she could talk to someone in the faculty later on and propose that they be more aware of this. But in that moment, it's sometimes really amazing for people to have affirmation from someone in the group that's also perpetuating the mistreatment. So then you do something, right? And what do? You use one of these skills. Now here's what's usually left out. After you intervene, you ask the other bystanders what they thought, or what they would have done, or what they would have done if you weren't there. So then you're using it as a learning experience for everyone. And some of you in the room who are well known as the person who will say something, right? Some of you, it gets really tiresome. And also it allows everyone to diffuse their responsibility onto you, because it's like, okay, now we'll look at you. You're supposed to say something. And that person who's supposed to say something, who we're glad that they say something, needs to come back to me and say, Alan, I think they need to hear from you this time, not me, because they're tired of listening to me and they don't take me seriously. And as you know, when I leave the room, they say it anyway. So when you're like a super bystander hero or heroine, then you need to use your role to train other people and not always take it on. So this last arrow is very important, is to, after the intervention, to engage the other bystanders and to say, well, what would you have done? What if, pretend you're the department chair and, you know, I'm one of your faculty members who makes an offensive remark, and you have to respond to it in the moment, but then privately you talk to the other faculty members of your department and you find out what they felt about the remark. Would they have said something if you weren't there, and what would they say if you weren't there? Because the person who says at a faculty meeting that female faculty can't write as many articles because they have babies is probably going to also say that somewhere else. So we want all the people who are somewhere else to say something. And I personally think that even though confrontation is a very effective skill, if every time that faculty member made that comment about women faculty, someone gave them examples of women faculty who have more publications than male faculty, whether or not they have children, then that person would eventually stop making that remark, because it wasn't doing them any good. Okay, so we're going to skip over this now, but you would think of the situation that you wrote. First, I would do some role plays in front of the group so we could see how I would do these different skills. Then you would go in groups of 3, and so the way we want these triads to work, and this is also for the people who aren't in the room now, at this moment or another time, an unknown time in the future, when maybe by that time I'll look completely different and you wouldn't recognize me. It works like this. One person is doing the intervening. One person is repeating the comment that was offensive to the person who's intervening. And the third person is the observer. So I'll read you another one just for fun. A male unit leader asked me to talk to female students and ask them to dress better to enhance their bodies. Can you imagine? This happens here. All the time, I'm sorry to say. Okay, so we're doing a role play. So pretend you wrote this. So the role play is, I pretend I'm the male unit leader, and I say, Sarah, could I ask you a favor? Would you be willing to talk to the other women in our department and ask them to dress a little better to enhance their bodies and their appearance? And now first Sarah just gets to tell me what a jerk I am and let her feelings out, if you want, but that could really be effective. But the point of the role play is she tries these different things. She makes a remark that's confrontational. She changes the subject. And then as a group of three, you discuss what you thought and how it felt. And of course, she's the one who decides which one is right for her. And the observer gives feedback. Usually the observer will give positive feedback first, like this was really good, what you did was really good, like this, and then you give suggestions. Now you switch it. Now everyone changes role, and a new person is practicing intervention, and another person is repeating their remark that upset them so that they could practice intervening. So after like 20 minutes, everyone has done each of those three roles. And you've each practiced using these different skills for your situation and brainstorming as a group the complexities. Because as we saw in our earlier discussion, there's a lot of complexities. And you need to acknowledge and think through the complexities, because the complexities determine what you do. And one of the complexities is yourself. Like you don't like to be confrontational, or it comes very easily, right? Or you can be very confrontational, but not with your supervisor. Or this situation triggers you because it reminds you of other similar oppressive mistreatment situations that you've experienced, and it brings up a lot of emotion. Now, I would encourage you to give yourself permission to feel the emotion and go to a safe place with a safe person where you can have that emotion. Because it's something that needs some healing in you. Like, I'll just be honest, when I told you before that I'm named after someone from the Holocaust, like a lot of stuff came up right in that moment. But like, this isn't the place, right? So now I know I want to talk to someone about that. Because there's something inside of me that needs some attention that I wasn't aware of until I said that. So it's also about us, and it's about our own healing work. And all of us have had experiences that limit our ability to be the fully great, beautiful, wonderful human beings that we are. So now we're going to postpone this. And it doesn't have to be, but it could be beneficial to meet in a group of three where you share a workplace or an identity, but it's not necessary. Oh no, this is a different, sorry. I'm confusing myself. This is a different activity, if we have time. Because the important part of this is, we, meaning the University of Minnesota system, has to figure out what are the bystander scenarios in different contexts, and what are the intervention skills in different contexts, and what are the barriers. Like, pretend the remark at the faculty meeting was made in a departmental meeting with all your departmental graduate students, and the graduate students were offended and they weren't sure how to intervene with the faculty member. It's a very different scenario than intervening with an equal, as we saw before. So we need to really tailor, we need to develop an understanding of all the ways that this is happening here, and all the ways it would be appropriate to respond to those different ways it is happening here, so that people feel empowered to do something, including people who are very traditionally disempowered, such as graduate students. and other marginalized groups. And one of the points that I made yesterday that I feel is absolutely essential is that people have visible, safe places to go and talk about what happens without anything having to happen. Because the first step is always to tell someone and have a chance to talk about it and then to understand what your options are. And in some of these situations where it feels like there's very few options, like I came here from far away and I don't know anyone and my future depends on my advisor giving me a good recommendation and also my financial livelihood, that may be a situation in which I really feel that there is nothing I could do and I have to put up with it, which is what a lot of people will tell you they did. It's always interesting to me. See, I have an advantage over all of you because I can see your faces. So it's always interesting to me when I say something and it's like, all these heads are, so it's like not hypothetical. So at least we need to have a place where that graduate student knows they can talk to someone without anyone else knowing and anything happening. That's the first step. So that's part of this discussion because in some cases people really feel, remember in the matrix, the first boxes decide whether or not you're going to intervene or not. And in some cases you really might not. And then when we're talking about the social norms piece, we want to say, what are the misperceptions that might influence how people intervene, and can we change those misperceptions? So, if you want to teach bystander intervention, you have to decide how you want to do it, and some of the campuses that we heard from yesterday have already implemented some of like the more packaged approaches, and I don't want to appear that I'm criticizing them. I'm just saying all of them need something more that they don't have, and this is an evolving field. 10 years ago we didn't have anything, so now it's great we have all these things that work a little. Now let's get them to work a lot. I don't want to appear to criticize any of the package programs, but I think I would try and build on them. And I always personally think that when you have the resources, it's better to develop your own. But I totally understand when you don't have the resources, it's better to do something than not do anything, and that sometimes for institutional PR reasons, it's necessary to bring in like a research-based, well-known program that has cachet. So that's a political decision that's also has a place in the discussion. And I would always recommend incorporating norms correction for the reasons that I've stated. And then talk about what combination of interventions. So, for instance, the debriefing conversation we're having this morning about different scenarios, how do we build that into whatever happens on campus so you create a lot of places and opportunities where people could talk about how they would intervene and if it worked and whatever, and make it possible for people to keep trying. So, how to eliminate the rebound? As I said, view bystander intervention as a process with mentoring and debriefing opportunities. So then how are we going to provide that? Design synergistic interventions to reinforce and support the bystander intervention, one of which would be a social norms effort. Include a normative feedback component in the bystander piece. Provide a variety of skills that are situation and identity specific. So I think if we give people a broader range of skills to practice in a broader range of situations, then you could imagine saying something to your boss, even though you might not confront them. Create an institutional culture that supports bystander intervention with leaders as models. You know, and I do work with the military. It's always interesting when I'm alone with a very, very senior person, like with STARS, which is an admiral in the Navy or a general in the others. And I say, when you were a bystander? It's amazing the stories you hear. And then I want to say to them, Don't make a video that says, we will not tolerate sexual assault in the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, blah, blah, blah. Say, when I was a captain, I was in this situation and I really wish I had done this. Because if I had done this, that rising officer who left the Navy or the Marines would be a general like me now, an admiral like me now. In other words, we need to make it really personal, and everyone who's in any kind of position has personal stories. And sharing the personal stories is what can really make a difference, because then it makes the whole thing very visible and real. And just not say on the, on the letter on the wall that we will not tolerate and everyone belongs here, when, some people might walk into this building and feel that they don't belong here. Now, personally, I'm not saying that in order to recommend that we should change the name of this building. That's for you to decide. But for sure, if you go next door and you read the plaque that's next to, this is unscripted, right? You go next door and read the plaque that next to the chair, it doesn't say anything about what Jung would call the shadow side of this individual. That he didn't want some of you and me here now. So if some people in this community still feel that his contribution to this community and the fact that his name is on this building needs to be preserved as let's say, a historical fact, we also would need to acknowledge the other historical facts that we are. So right now, I'm not being a bystander. I'm telling you how I feel. And it's being taped for other people to hear, which is even better. So the point is, when we deal with these complex issues, we need to deal with them in an honest way and put all the information on the table. And then we could decide what to do. And in some cases, you might change the name or you might remove the statue or, things like that. But at least we all know what we're talking about. And we're not glorifying someone who did some good things at the expense of talking about the heinous things that they did. Even if they were a product of their time, it was still wrong. And there were people at the same time who weren't buying into it. So that's my speech. I didn't have a slide for that. Okay. That was my bystander role play. Concluding remarks. Change takes time and collaboration. Doing less can be more effective than trying to do too much. Because what happens a lot of times is there's so much pressure to do something that people don't develop the infrastructure and they just do something really quick, and then if it has any effects, they're very short-lived. Sometimes it gives people the feeling that they're doing something. And since we like to feel that we're doing something, it makes us temporarily feel better, but it doesn't really change anything over the long run. We obviously need to adjust the barriers. So, if we want to provide safe places for graduate students to talk about very significant issues that could affect the rest of their life, we don't put that person's office next to the department chair. And everyone will see me knocking, going in the door. We have to think through all these things, how we do them. Same thing, obviously, for sexual assault victims, etc. What is the long-range vision and how you want to get there in the steering committee? Well, this one you get an A++. This one is already why I'm here. And I'm sorry to say it's so very unusual. A few weeks ago, I talked to the human resources director of one of the major Hollywood talent agencies, because Hollywood is worried about all this. And this person gave me such amazing positive feedback. I got an A++ for this phone call. They loved everything I was saying, and I haven't heard from that person since. And it's so common because it's so difficult to do it, right? Sarah's nodding her head. It's so difficult to do it that a lot of people don't make the investment. I really respect your president because he wants us to be his legacy, and he's willing to make the investment, and as they say, he's willing to put his money or your money where his mouth is. So, so you're off to a really good start, because with this type of infrastructure, it won't work without this type of infrastructure. And there's no guarantee if it will work, but you're in the right direction. So we want to get key stakeholders on board. I thought it was really great that the regions had to take the EverFi course that's going to be given to the faculty. That was brilliant. And I understand that your president got some flack about the course from one of the regions. And after the region took the course, that person changed their mind. So that's how it works. It's just like tomorrow we'll talk about when you tell people what the true norm is, they don't believe you. Of course they don't believe you, because they don't think it's true, because they heard everyone talking about Barry and Alan dancing on this table at the party. I could tell by Barry's reaction that it was okay that I chose him for that. And we both know it's hypothetical, because I don't know him. So you need to really get your key stakeholders on board so that they work through their concerns and don't sabotage what you're doing. And sometimes when you can't, you have to find a way to compartmentalize them so they don't do damage and you go forward without them. Or, some people you just have to wait for them to retire. I'll tell you a great little story about a bystander intervention. So I went to, I was doing training with one of the National Guards, and there was a female sergeant, and she was in officer training school, which meant she was going to become a captain. She was going to get, she was going to become an officer. Now she's what's called the non-commissioned officer. And her senior leader was this old-timer male who didn't like women in the military. And he said in front of everyone, if I ever have to work for women, I'm retiring. Guess what she did when she became a captain? She asked to be his supervisor. And he retired. Which I think was probably a good thing for the National Guard of that particular state. So some people are not going to change, and they're going to give us a hard time until the very end, and we just go forward without them. And we'd be very strategic about how to isolate them sufficiently that they don't block what we're doing. And we don't want to leave out the policy enforcement issues, because we know that policies work when they're seen as fair, when they're promptly enforced. There's one more that I forgot. But it's like I said yesterday, I only drive a certain amount over the speeding limit because I know I'm going to get a ticket. But a sexual perpetrator perpetrates because he knows he's not going to get in trouble. So policies and procedures are part of the discussion, and they're necessary but not sufficient. So we want people to be more likely to intervene when they know that other people also want to intervene and will support them. We can create a culture which people feel supported to behave in compassionate and caring ways. And I wrote a book on this, and there's stuff on my website, and there's a lot of boring articles on my website. So let's do this. Now we're done with the official filmed part of this presentation, so thanks you to all who are watching this, who are not here. And we hope that this has been worth your time. And we hope that you will take the opportunity to practice the bystander intervention skills that have been presented, which are also in the book I mentioned, which is called Responsibility. And now we will, in this room, those of us who are here have a chance to practice. Some of you may need to leave, and whoever stays will do the little groups of three, and then we'll debrief together as a group. And I think we won't have time for this small group discussion, and maybe some of that we could do tomorrow, but I would just say that it's really important that you think about how to adapt all this to where you live on this campus, and to talk to others in your environment so that you can tailor it. Because one of the key elements of effective prevention is that it needs to be tailored to the audience. And of course, when you have all these experts and consultants coming in who don't look, act like, or are part of the audience, telling them what they need to do, then it's a guaranteed recipe for failure. And unfortunately, a lot of what we call science, right, has done that. Like even in the pharmaceutical industry, to assume that female bodies work like male bodies and to make up dosages for drugs. I mean, there's all these, we don't have to talk about that here, but hopefully you have courses on it, right? How science reproduces oppressions. So we need to tailor it to the contexts here, and we need to figure out how to place knowledgeable, trained people in those contexts so it could be implemented. And it will be a challenge because a university this big has so many different contexts. But I think it's doable. So let's do this now. Anyone that needs to leave, thank you for your time and attention. Anyone that wants to say, find 2 other people, and you will share your scenario, either the one you wrote here or another one. I'm not going to have time to do role plays in front of you, but hopefully I gave you enough examples. You're going to pick your scenario or another one that's important to you, and you're going to tell the other 2 people the scenario. And then one person is going to make the remark or engage in the offensive behavior. And then you're going to try and respond. And what I encourage you to do is try to respond by confronting the person. Try to respond by distraction or reframing a negative with a positive. And then try and practice engaging the person in a conversation. And then you switch and you go around. And I'll yell out around every 5 or 7 minutes when it's time to switch. You don't have to switch in that moment, but within a reasonable time so that everyone gets to practice. Okay? And then at 5 of 12, we'll just regroup, or 10 of 12 for a little debriefing. So, and remember, it can be upsetting to remember these things, and because it is upsetting, it's okay to get upset. But it could also be fun to figure out how to effectively intervene in a way that makes a difference. Okay, so have fun, and it's okay to get upset.